William Burges R/BRDS/ December 2, 1827, April 20, 1881 was an English architect and designer. Among the greatest of the Victorian art architects, he sought in his work to escape from both 19th-century industrialization and the neoclassical architectural style and re-establish the architectural and social values of a utopian medieval England. Burges stands within the tradition of the Gothic Revival, his works echoing those of the pre-Raphaelites and heralding those of the arts and crafts movement. Burges's career was short but illustrious. He won his first major commission for St. Finbarr's Cathedral in Cork in 1863, when he was 35, and he died, in 1881, at his Kensington home, the Tower House, aged only 53. His architectural output was small but varied. Working with a long-standing team of craftsmen, he built churches, a cathedral, a warehouse, a university, a school, houses and castles. Burges's most notable works are Cardiff Castle, constructed between 1866 and 1928, and Castell Coch 1870-91, both of which were built for John Crichton Stuart, 3rd Marquess of Bute. Other significant buildings include Gayhurst House, Buckinghamshire 1858-65, Knightshays Court 1867-74, the Church of Christ the Consoler 1870-76, St Mary's, Studley Royal 1870-78, in Yorkshire, and Park House, Cardiff 1871-80. Many of his designs were never executed or were subsequently demolished or altered. His competition entries for cathedrals at Lille 1854, Adelaide 1856, Colombo, Brisbane 1859, Edinburgh 1873, and Truro 1878 were all unsuccessful. He lost out to George Edmund Street in the competition for the Royal Courts of Justice 1866-67 in the Strand. His plans for the redecoration of the interior of St. Paul's Cathedral 1870-77 were abandoned and he was dismissed from his post. Skilbeck's Warehouse 1865-66 was demolished in the 1970s, and work at Salisbury Cathedral 1855-59, at Worcester College, Oxford 1873-79, and at Knightshays Court had been lost in the decades before. Beyond architecture, Burges designed metalwork, sculpture, jewelry, furniture and stained glass. Art Applied to Industry, a series of lectures he gave to the Society of Arts in 1864, illustrates the breadth of his interests. The topics covered including glass, pottery, brass and iron, gold and silver, furniture, the weaver's art and external architectural decoration. For most of the century following his death, Victorian architecture was neither the subject of intensive study nor sympathetic attention and Burges's work was largely ignored. However, the revival of interest in Victorian art, architecture, and design in the later 20th century has led to a renewed appreciation of Burges and his work. Early life and travels. Burges was born on December 2, 1827, the son of Alfred Burges (1796–1886), a wealthy civil engineer. Alfred made a considerable fortune, some £113,000 £11,296,640 in 2018 adjusted for inflation at his death, enabling his son to devote his life to the study and practice of architecture without requiring that he actually earn a living. Burges entered King's College School, London, in 1839 to study engineering, his contemporaries there including Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Michael Rossetti. He left in 1844 to join the office of Edward Blore, surveyor to Westminster Abbey. Blore was an established architect, having worked for both William IV and Queen Victoria, and had made his reputation as a proponent of the Gothic Revival. In 1848 or 1849, Burges moved to the offices of Matthew Digby Wyatt. Wyatt was as prominent an architect as Blore, evidenced by his leading role in the direction of the Great Exhibition in 1851. Burges's work with Wyatt, particularly on the medieval court for this exhibition, was influential on the subsequent course of his career. During this period, he also worked on drawings of medieval metalwork for Wyatt's book, Metalwork, published in 1852, and assisted Henry Clutton with illustrations for his works. Of equal importance to Burges's subsequent career was his traveling. Burges believed that all architects should travel, remarking that it was absolutely necessary to see how various art problems have been resolved in different ages by different men. Enabled by his private income, Burges moved through England, then France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece and finally into Turkey. In total, he spent some 18 months abroad developing his skills and knowledge by sketching and drawing. What he saw and drew provided a repository of influences and ideas that he used and reused for the whole of his career. Although he never went beyond Turkey, the art and architecture of the East, both near and far, had a significant impact on them, His fascination with Moorish design found ultimate expression in the Arab room at Cardiff Castle, and his study of Japanese techniques influenced his later metalwork. Burges received his first important commission at the age of 35, but his subsequent career did not see the development that might have been expected. His style had already been formed over the previous 20 years of study, thinking and traveling. J. Mordaunt Crook, the foremost authority on Burges, writes that, once established, after 20 years' preparation, his design language had merely to be applied, and he applied and reapplied the same vocabulary with increasing subtlety and gusto. Early works. In 1856 Burges established his own architectural practice in London at 15 Buckingham Street, the Strand. Some of his early pieces of furniture were created for this office and were later moved to the Tower House, Melbury Road, Kensington, the home he built for himself towards the end of his life. His early architectural career produced nothing of major note, although he won prestigious commissions for Lille Cathedral, the Crimea Memorial Church and the Bombay School of Art. None were built to Burges's designs. His failed entry for the law courts in the Strand, if successful, would have given London its own Carcassonne, the plans being described by the architectural writers Dickson and Muthesius as a recreation of a 13th-century dream world with a skyline of great inventiveness. In 1859, he submitted a French-inspired design for St. John's Cathedral in Brisbane, Australia, which was rejected. He also provided designs for Colombo Cathedral in Ceylon and St. Francis Xavier's Cathedral, Adelaide, without success. In 1855, however, he obtained a commission for the reconstruction of the chapter house of Salisbury Cathedral. Henry Clutton was the lead architect, but Burges, as assistant, contributed to the restoration of the sculpture and to the general decorative scheme. Much was lost in restorations of the 1960s. More lasting was Burges's work of 1858 onwards in the substantial remodeling of Gayhurst House, in Buckinghamshire, for Robert Carrington, 2nd Baron Carrington. Rooms there contain some of his large signature fireplaces, with carving by Burges's longtime collaborator Thomas Nicholls, in particular those in the drawing room which include motifs from Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. He also designed a circular lavatory for the male servants, which Jeremy Cooper describes as being surmounted by a growling Cerberus, each of his 3 heads inset with bloodshot glass eyes. In 1859 Burges began work with Ambrose Poynter on the Maison Dieu, Dover, which was completed in 1861. Emulation of the original medieval style can be seen in his renovation of the grotesque animals and in the coats of arms incorporated into his new designs. Burges later designed the council chamber, added in 1867, and in 1881 began work on Connaught Hall in Dover, a town meeting and concert hall. The new building contained meeting rooms and mayoral and official offices. Although Burges designed the project, most of it was completed after his death by his partners, Pullen and Chappell. The listed status of the Maison Dieu was reclassified as Grade I in 2017 and Dover District Council, the building's owner, is seeking grant funding to enable a restoration, focusing on Burges's work. In 1859-60, Burges took over the restoration of Waltham Abbey from Poynter, working with Poynter's son Edward Poynter and with furniture makers Harland and Fisher. He commissioned Edward Burne-Jones of James Powell Sons to make 3 stained glass windows for the east end, representing the Tree of Jesse. The Abbey is a demonstration of Burges's skills as a restorer, with a profound sensitivity towards medieval architecture. Mordaunt Crook wrote of Burges's interior that, it meets the Middle Ages as an equal. In 1861-2, Burges was commissioned by Charles Edward Lafoy, secretary to the Speaker of the House of Commons, to build All Saints' Church, Fleet, as a memorial to Lafoy's wife. She was the daughter of James Walker, who established the Marine Engineering Company of Walker and Burges with Burges's father Alfred, and this family connection brought Burges the commission. Pevsner says of Fleet that it has no shape, nor character nor notable buildings, except one, that one being All Saints. The church is of red brick and Pevsner considered it astonishingly restrained. The interior too is simply decorated, but the massive sculpture, particularly of the tomb of the Lefroys and of the gabled arch below which the tomb originally stood, is quintessentially Burges, Crook describing it as not so much muscular Gothic as muscle-bound. St. Finbarr's Cathedral, Cork. Despite early competition setbacks, Burges was sustained by his belief that early French provided the answer to the crisis of architectural style that beset mid-Victorian England, writing "I was brought up in the 13th century belief and in that belief I intend to die," and in 1863, at the age of 35, he finally secured his first major commission, for St. Finbarr's Cathedral, Cork. Burges's diary records his delight at the result. Cork. The competition for St. Finbarrs occurred as a result of widespread dissatisfaction with the existing church of 1735, which the Dublin builder described as a shabby apology for a cathedral which has long disgraced Cork. It was to be the first new cathedral built in the British Isles since St. Paul's. The proposed budget was low, at £15,000, but Burges ignored this constraint, producing a design that he admitted would cost twice as much. Despite the protestations of fellow competitors, it won, though the final cost was to be in excess of £100,000. Burges, who had worked in Ireland before, at the Church of St. Peter, Carrigrohan, at the Holy Trinity Church Temple Bredy, at Frankfield and at Douglas, enjoyed strong local support, including that of the bishop, John Gregg. In addition, as the Ireland Handbook notes, Burges combined his love of medievalism with a conspicuous display of Protestant affluence, which was an important factor at a time when the established Anglican Church in Ireland was seeking to assert its predominance. For the exterior, Burges reused some of his earlier unexecuted plans, the overall design from the Crimea Memorial Church and St. John's Cathedral, Brisbane, the elevations from Lille Cathedral. The main problem of the building was its size. Despite the prodigious efforts of its fundraisers, and despite Burges exceeding the original budget, Cork was still unable to afford a really large cathedral. Burges overcame this obstacle by using the grandeur of his three-spired exterior to offset the lesser scale of the remainder of the building. Although the cathedral is modest in size, it is very richly ornamented. As was his usual practice, from his office in Buckingham Street and in the course of many site visits, Burges oversaw all aspects of the design, including the statuary, the stained glass and the furniture, charging 10% rather than his usual 5%. Owing to the high level of his personal involvement. He drew designs for every one of the 1,260 sculptures that adorn the west front and decorate the building inside and out. He sketched cartoons for the majority of the 74 stained glass windows. He designed the mosaic pavement, the altar, the pulpit and the bishop's throne. Lawrence and Wilson consider the result undoubtedly Burges's greatest work in ecclesiastical architecture, with an interior that is overwhelming and intoxicating. Through his ability, by the careful leadership of his team, by total artistic control, and by vastly exceeding the intended budget of £15,000, Burges produced a building that in size is little more than a large parish church, but in impression is described in Lawrence and Wilson's study as a cathedral becoming such a city, and one which posterity may regard as a monument to the Almighty's praise. Architectural team. Burges inspired considerable loyalty within his team of assistants, and his partnerships were long-lived. John Starling Chappell was the office manager, joining Burges's practice in 1859. It was Chappell, designer of most of the furniture for Castelcock, who completed its restoration after Burges's death. Second to Chappell was William Frame, who acted as clerk of works. Horatio Walter Lonsdale was Burges's chief artist, contributing extensive murals for both Castelcock and Cardiff Castle. His main sculptor was Thomas Nicholls, who started with Burges at Cork, completing hundreds of figures for St. Finbarrs Cathedral, worked with him on his two major churches in Yorkshire, and undertook all of the original carving for the animal wall at Cardiff. William Gualbert Saunders joined the Buckingham Street team in 1865 and worked with Burges on the development of the design and techniques of stained glass manufacture, producing much of the best glass for St. Finbarrs. Secardo Egidio Fucino was another longtime collaborator who sculpted the Madonna and Child above the drawbridge at Castelcock, the figure of St. John over the mantelpiece in Lord Bute's bedroom at Cardiff Castle, and the bronze Madonna in the roof garden. Lastly, there was Axel Haig, a Swedish-born illustrator, who prepared many of the watercolor perspectives with which Burges entranced his clients. Crook calls them a group of talented men, molded in their master's image, art architects and medievalists to a man, jokers and jesters too, devoted above all to art rather than to business. Partnership with the Marquis of Bute. In 1865, Burges met John Patrick Crichton Stewart, 3rd Marquis of Bute. This may have resulted from Alfred Burges's engineering firm, Walker, Burges, and Cooper, having undertaken work on the East Bute docks in Cardiff for the 2nd Marquis. The 3rd Marquis became Burges's greatest architectural patron. Both were men of their times, both had fathers whose industrial endeavors provided the means for their sons' architectural achievements, and both sought to redeem the evils of industrialism by reliving the art of the Middle Ages. On his succession to the marquisate at the age of 1, Bute inherited an income of £300,000 a year, and, by the time he met Burges, he was considered the richest man in Britain, if not the world. Bute's wealth was important to the success of the partnership, as Burges himself wrote, "Good art is far too rare and far too precious ever to be cheap." But, as a scholar, antiquarian, compulsive builder and enthusiastic medievalist, Butte brought more than money to the relationship and his resources and his interests allied with Burges's genius to create what Maclise considers to be Butte's most memorable overall achievement. A prime example of the partnership of aristocratic patron and talented architect producing the marvels of Cardiff Castle and Castell Coch. Dixon and Muthesius characterizing the relationship between Burges and Butte. However occasioned, the connection lasted the rest of Burges's life and led to his most important works. To the Marquis and his wife, Burges was the sole inspiring one. The architectural writer Michael Hall considers Burges's rebuilding of Cardiff Castle and the complete reconstruction of the ruin of Castell Coch, north of the city, as representing his highest achievements. In these buildings, Crook contends that Burges escaped into a world of architectural fantasy which Hall describes as amongst the most magnificent the Gothic revival ever achieved. Cardiff Castle. In the early 19th century, the original Norman castle had been enlarged and refashioned by Henry Holland for the first Marquis, the third Marquis's great-grandfather. The second Marquis occupied the castle on visits to his extensive Glamorgan estates, during which he developed modern Cardiff and created Cardiff Docks as the outlet for coal and steel from the South Wales valleys, but did little to the castle itself, beyond completing the first Marquis's work. The third Marquis despised Holland's efforts, describing the castle as having been the victim of every barbarism since the Renaissance, and, on his coming of age, engaged Burges to undertake rebuilding on a Wagnerian scale. Almost all of Burges's usual team were involved, including Chappell, Frame, and Lonsdale, creating a building which John Newman describes in Glamorgan the Buildings of Wales as the most successful of all the fantasy castles of the 19th century. The skyline of the capital of Wales, the dream of one great patron and one great architect, has almost become the symbol of a whole nation. Crook describing the castle's silhouette. Work began in 1868 with the 150 feet high clock tower, in Forest of Dean Ashlar. The tower forms a suite of bachelors' rooms, the Marquis not marrying until 1872. They comprise a bedroom, a servant's room and the summer and winter smoking rooms. Externally, the tower is a reworking of a design Burges used for the unsuccessful law courts competition. Internally, the rooms are sumptuously decorated with gilding, carvings and cartoons, many allegorical in style, depicting the seasons, myths and fables. In his A History of the Gothic Revival, written as the tower was being built, Charles Locke Eastlake wrote of Burges's peculiar talents and luxuriant fancy. The summer smoking room is the tower's literal and metaphorical culmination. It rises 2 stories high and has an internal balcony that, through an unbroken band of windows, gives views to Cardiff Docks, one source of Butte's wealth, the Bristol Channel, and the Welsh hills and valleys. The floor has a map of the world in mosaic and the sculpture is by Thomas Nichols. As the castle was developed, work continued with alterations to Holland's Georgian range, including his Butte Tower, and to the medieval Herbert and Beauchamp Towers, and the construction of the Guest Tower and the Octagonal Tower. In plan, the castle broadly follows the arrangement of a standard Victorian stately home. The Butte Tower includes Lord Butte's bedroom and ends in another highlight, the roof garden, with a sculpture of the Madonna by Fuchsia. Butte's bedroom has much religious iconography and a mirrored ceiling. The Marquis's name, John, is repeated in Greek, Iota Omega Alpha Sigma, along the ceiling beams. The Octagon Tower followed, including the oratory, built on the spot where Butte's father died, and the Chaucer Room, the roof of which Mark Gerard cites as a superb example of Burges's genius in the construction of roofs. The Guest Tower contains the site of the original kitchen at its base and above, the nursery, decorated with painted tiles depicting Aesop's fables and characters from nursery rhymes. The central block of the castle comprises the 2-story banqueting hall, with the library below. Both are enormous, the former to act as a suitable reception hall where the Marquis could fulfill his civic duties, the latter to hold part of his vast library. Both include elaborate carvings and fireplaces, those in the banqueting hall depicting the castle itself in the time of Robert, Duke of Normandy, who was imprisoned there in 1126 to 1134. The fireplace in the library contains 5 figures, 4 representing the Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew and Assyrian alphabets, while the 5th is said to represent Butte as a Celtic monk. The figures refer to the purpose of the room and to the Marquis, a noted linguist. The decoration of these large rooms is less successful than in the smaller chambers. Much was completed after Burges's death and Gerard considers that the muralist, Lonsdale, was required to cover areas rather greater than his talents deserved. The central portion of the castle also included the grand staircase. Illustrated in a watercolor perspective prepared by Axel Haig, the staircase was long thought never to have been built, but recent research has shown that it was constructed, only to be torn out in the 1930s, reputedly after the third Marchioness had once slipped on its polished surface. The staircase was not universally praised in the contemporary press, the building news writing that the design was one of the least happy we have seen from Minster Burges's pencil. The contrasts of color are more startling than pleasing. The Arab room in the Herbert Tower was the last room on which Burges was working when he fell ill in 1881. Butte placed Burges's initials, together with his own and the date, in the fireplace of that room as a memorial. The room was completed by Burges's brother-in-law, Richard Popplewell Pullen. Following Burges's death, further areas of the castle were developed along the lines he had set by, amongst others, William Frame. This included extensive reconstruction of the walls of the original Roman fort. The Animal Wall, completed in the 1920s by the 4th Marquess, originally stood between the castle moat and the city and has 9 sculptures by Thomas Nichols, with a further 6 sculpted by Alexander Carrick in the 1930s. The Swiss Bridge, which once crossed the moat to the pre-Raphaelite garden encompassed by the Animal Wall, was removed in the 1930s. The stables, which lie to the north, on the edge of Butte Park, were designed by Burges in 1868-69. Megan Aldrich contends that Burges's interiors at Cardiff have rarely been equaled, although he executed few buildings as his rich fantastic Gothic required equally rich patrons. His finished works are outstanding monuments to 19th-century Gothic, the suites of rooms he created at Cardiff being amongst the most magnificent that the Gothic revival ever achieved. Crook goes further still, arguing that the rooms reach beyond architecture to create three-dimensional passports to fairy kingdoms and realms of gold. In Cardiff Castle we enter a land of dreams. The castle was given to Cardiff City Corporation by the 5th Marquess of Bute in 1947. Castell-Coch. In 1872, while work at Cardiff Castle was proceeding, Burges presented a scheme for the complete reconstruction of Castell-Coch, a ruined 13th-century fort on the Bute estate to the north of Cardiff. Burges's report on the possible reconstruction was delivered in 1872 but building was delayed until 1875, in part because of the pressure of works at Cardiff Castle and in part because of an unfounded concern on behalf of the Marquess's trustees that he was facing bankruptcy. The exterior comprises 3 towers, described by Newman as almost equal to each other in diameter, but arrestingly dissimilar in height. Burges's main inspiration was the work of the almost contemporaneous French architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who was undertaking similar restoration and building work for Napoleon III. Viollet-le-Duc's work at the Château de Cossey, the Louvre and particularly at the Château de Pierrefonds is echoed at Castell-Coch. Burges's drawing room roof drawing heavily on the octagonal, revaulted Chambre de l'Impératrice at Pierrefonds. Burges's other main source was the Château de Chillon, from which his conical, and conjectural, tower roofs are derived. Severely damaged during Welsh rebellions in the early 14th century, Castell-Coch fell into disuse and by the Tudor period, the antiquary John Leland described it as all in ruin, no big thing but high. A set of drawings for the planned rebuilding exists, together with a full architectural justification by Burges. The castle reconstruction features 3 conical roofs to the towers that are historically questionable. According to Crook, Burges supported his roofs with a considerable body of examples of doubtful validity. The truth was that he wanted them for their architectural effect. The distant view, of unequal drum towers rising under candle-snuffer roofs from the wooded hillside, is irresistibly appealing. Here the castle of romantic dreams is given substance. Newman describing the prospect of Castell-Coch. The keep tower, the well tower and the kitchen tower comprise a series of apartments, of which the main sequence, the castellan's rooms, lie within the keep. They begin weekly, the banqueting hall, completed well after Burges's death, being described by Newman as dilute and unfocused while Crook considers it anemic. It contains a colossal chimney piece, carved by Thomas Nichols. The identity of the central figure in the overmantel is uncertain. Gerard states that it is King David while Maclise suggests that it depicts St. Lucius. The drawing room is a double-height room with decoration that Newman describes as illustrating the intertwined themes of the fecundity of nature and the fragility of life. A stone fireplace by Nichols features the 3 fates, spinning, measuring and cutting the thread of life. The murals around the walls draw on Aesop's fables with delicate drawings of animals in the aesthetic movement style. The octagonal chamber with its great rib vault, modeled on Viollet-le-Duc's chambers at Cossey and Pierrefonds, is decorated with drawings of butterflies and birds. Off the hall lies the windlass room, in which Burges delighted in assembling the fully functioning apparatus for the drawbridge, together with murder holes for expelling boiling oil. The Marquess's bedroom provides some Spartan relief before the culmination of the castle, Lady Bute's bedroom. Crook considers this room pure Burges an arcaded circle, punched through by window embrasures, and topped by a trefoil section dome. The decorative theme is love, symbolized by monkeys, pomegranates and nesting birds. The decoration was completed long after Burges's death, but his was the guiding spirit. Would Minster Burges have done it? William Frame wrote to Thomas Nichols in 1887. Burges's original design for the castle included a chapel to be built on the roof of the well tower. It was never finished and the remains were removed in the late 19th century. Following Burges's death in 1881, work on the interior continued for another 10 years. The castle was little used, the Marquis never came after its completion, and its main function was as a family sanatorium, although the Marchioness and her daughter, Lady Margaret Crichton Stuart, did occupy it for a period following the death of the Marquis in 1900. In 1950, the 5th Marquis of Bute handed the castle over to the Ministry of Works. Maclise views it as one of the greatest Victorian triumphs of architectural composition, whilst Crook writes of Burges recreating from a heap of rubble a fairy tale castle which seems almost to have materialized from the margins of a medieval manuscript. Later works. Bute's commissions formed the major corpus of Burges's work from the 1860s until his death. However, he continued to accept other appointments. Worcester College, Oxford. The interiors of the hall and chapel of Worcester College, Oxford, had been designed by James Wyatt in 1776-90. In 1864, Burges was commissioned to overhaul Wyatt's unremarkable designs for the chapel by the Rev. H. C. O'Daniel, a member of the college's senior common room and future provost, who had known Burges when they were contemporaries at King's College London. Burges's extensive iconography envelopes the building, with animals and birds depicted on the end of pews, and Burges's mosaic flooring astonished his contemporaries. Drawing on his rare knowledge of medieval techniques and working with his meticulous attention to detail, Burges created a chapel that Crook describes as almost unique amongst high Victorian ecclesiastical interiors. The richly symbolic iconography and Masonic influences on the scheme of decoration are significant, Gillingham suggesting that Burges's Freemasonry connections were a partial explanation for his appointment and noting that a symbolic Masonic commentary pervades the chapel. Unusually, in the redecoration of the chapel, Burges did not use members of his usual team. The stained glass and the ceiling paintings are by Henry Holliday, and the statues, lectern and candlesticks are by William Grinsell Nicol. Exit Burges. The College Fellows will be sorry in 50 years. Pevsner on the College Fellows' decision to remove Burges's work in the hall and reinstate that of Wyatt. In 1873-79 Burges undertook a redecoration of the college's hall. The funds needed for the hall were raised by an appeal in which the decorated wooden panels on the walls were individual gifts, incorporating the crests and shields of the donors. In some cases, where there were no known crests or shields, those of former members were substituted and Burges made several painted imitations of marbling on wood. The large window at the end of the hall was also filled with the armorial bearings for which room had not been found in the panels. A fireplace was also inserted on the dais. Almost all of Burges's work in the hall was lost in a redevelopment of the 1960s in which Wyatt's designs were reinstated, although the fireplace was removed to Knightshays Court and the east window, above the high table, was restored circa 2009. Skilbeck's Warehouse. Skilbeck's Warehouse, formerly at 46 Upper Thames Street, London, and now demolished, was a drysalter's warehouse constructed by Burges in 1866 and as important as his only foray into industrial design. Burges was commissioned by the Skilbeck brothers to remodel an existing warehouse. The result was influential, Eastlake describing it as one of the very few instances of the successful adaptation of Gothic for commercial purposes. Bradley writes of Burges's remodeling as using twin-pointed bays under a single Gothic relieving arch and gable. The use of exposed cast iron was revolutionary. Modern materials and technologies were combined with Gothic iconography. An article of 1886 in the Ecclesiologist describing the great crane supported by a corbel carved into a bust of a fair Oriental maid, symbolizing the clime from which so much of the drysalter's materials are brought, and over a circular window in the gable a ship bringing in its precious freight. The total cost of the work was £1,413. Knightshays Court. The commission for the brand new house of Knightshays Court was obtained from Sir John Heathcote Amory in 1867 and the foundation stone was laid in 1869. By 1874, the building was still incomplete, owing to ongoing difficulties with Heathcote Amory, who objected to many of Burges's designs on the grounds of cost and of style. Although work had begun on the interior, the turbulent relationship between architect and client led to Burges's sacking in 1874 and his replacement by John Dibley Crace. Nevertheless, Knightshays Court remains the only example of a medium-sized Burges country house, built in a standard Victorian arrangement. Early French Gothic in style, it follows a standard Neo-Tudor plan of a large central block with projecting gables. The tower Burges planned was never built. Judging by the mix-and-match style of its construction, Evidently the Heathcote Amory and Burges never quite managed to agree on the eventual style of the house. Burges' obsession with the Middle Ages resulted in a plethora of stone curlicues, ornate mantels and carved figurines, but Amory preferred austere Victorian grandeur, best seen in the billiard room and the ornate boudoir. David Else commenting on the design of Nightshade Court in the Lonely Planet Guide to England. The interior was to have been a riot of Burgesian excess, but not a single room was completed to Burges's designs. Of the few interior features that were fully executed, much was altered or diluted by Heathcote Amory and his successors. However, some of the interiors, such as the library, vaulted hall and the arched red drawing room, remain or have been reinstated. Since the house passed to the National Trust in 1972, major works of restoration and recreation have been undertaken and a number of pieces of Burges furniture, mostly not original to the house, are displayed. These include a bookcase from Buckingham Street and a chimney piece from the hall at Worcester College, Oxford, where, in the 1960s, some decorative works by Burges were removed, although his redecoration of the college chapel remains. The aim is, as far as possible, to reinstate the work of Burges and Crace. Park House, Cardiff, was built by Burges for Lord Bute's engineer, James McConaughey, between 1871 and 1875. With its steep roofs and boldly textured walls, Park House revolutionized Cardiff's domestic architecture, and was highly influential, in the city and beyond. The impact of the building can be seen in many of Cardiff's inner suburbs, where imitations of Park House and its features can frequently be identified. Cadw described it as perhaps the most important 19th-century house in Wales, a position reflected in its status as a Grade I listed building. The style of the house is early French Gothic, with triangle and rectangle to the fore, although it is without the conical tower Burges considered appropriate both for his own home, the Tower House, and for Castell Coch. Burges used various building stones for Park House: Pennant sandstone for the walls, Bath stone around the windows, entrance porch and plinths, with pillars in pink Peterhead granite from Aberdeenshire. The external frontage comprises 4 gables, the windows of the last gable concealing what Newman describes as the major peculiarity of the interior. On entering, one is immediately confronted by the underside of the staircase, and has to skirt round it to reach the rest of the house. The arrangement was not repeated at the Tower House, which is an almost reversed replica with added conical tower. The interior fittings are of high quality, including the massive, mahogany staircase and marble chimney pieces. Both the drawing room and the dining room have beamed ceilings. The whole is built with a solidity that was guaranteed by the use of the Marquis of Bute's own workforce from Cardiff Docks. Christ the Consoler, St. Mary's and St. Paul's Cathedral. Burges's 2 finest Gothic churches were also undertaken in the 1870s, the Church of Christ the Consoler, Skelton-on-Ure, and St. Mary's, Studley Royal. His patron, George Robinson, 1st Marquis of Ripon, although not as rich as Bute, was his equal in romantic medievalism and had been a friend of Bute's at Oxford, which may account for the choice of Burges as architect. Both churches were built as memorial churches for Ripon's brother-in-law, Frederick Grantham Viner, who was murdered by Greek bandits in 1870. Viner's mother commissioned the Church of Christ the Consoler and his sister St. Mary's. Both begun in 1870, Skelton was consecrated in 1876 and Studley Royal in 1878. The Church of Christ the Consoler, in the grounds of Newby Hall in North Yorkshire, is built in the early English style. The exterior is constructed of grey Catrag stone, with mortar stone for the mouldings. The interior is faced with white limestone, and richly fitted out with marble. The work was undertaken by members of Burges's usual team, Gualbert Saunders making the stained glass, from cartoons by Lonsdale, and Nichols sculpting the carvings. Leach and Pevsner describe the scheme of stained glass as uncommonly excellent. It is particularly interesting as representing an architectural move from Burges's favorite early French style to an English inspiration. Pevsner considers it of determined originality. The impression is one of great opulence, even if of a somewhat elephantine caliber. Our ancestors had their churches made as beautiful as they could afford. A great cathedral must have been an encyclopedia of all the knowledge at the time. It is only by acting in a similar manner that we shall ever progress and have an art of our own. Burges commenting on churches in 1867. The Church of St. Mary, Studley Royal, is also in the early English style and is located in the grounds of Studley Royal Park at Fountains Abbey, in North Yorkshire. As at Christ the Consoler, the exterior is of grey limestone, with a 2-stage west tower topped with a soaring spire. The interior is equally spectacular, exceeding Skelton in richness and majesty, Leach commenting that everything is precisely calculated as to its visual impact. The theme, previously used at Gayhurst, is Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. The stained glass, by Saunders Co., is of particularly high quality. Pevsner describes St. Mary's as a dream of early English glory, and Crook writes, "Although Cork Cathedral may stand as Burges's greatest Gothic work, Studley Royal is his ecclesiastical masterpiece." Burges also constructed an estate cottage in 1873. In 1870, Burges was asked to draw up an iconographic scheme of internal decoration for St. Paul's Cathedral, unfinished since the death of Sir Christopher Wren. In 1872, he was appointed architect and over the next 5 years produced what Crook describes as a full-blown scheme of early Renaissance decoration for the interior, which he intended would eclipse that of St. Peter's in Rome. However, as Crook writes, his plans were rather too creative for most classicists, and these artistic, and linked religious, controversies led to Burges's dismissal in 1877 with none of his plans undertaken. Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut. In 1872, Abner Jackson, the president of Trinity College, Connecticut, visited Britain, seeking models and an architect for a planned new campus for the college. Burges was chosen and he drew up a 4-quadrangled master plan, in his early French style. Lavish illustrations were produced by Axel Haig. However, the estimated cost, at just under $1 million, together with the sheer scale of the plans, thoroughly alarmed the college trustees. Only 1/6 of the plan was executed, the present Long Walk, with Francis H. Kimball acting as local, supervising, architect, and Frederick Law Olmsted laying out the grounds. Crook considers the result unsatisfactory, but important, in its key position in the development of late 19th century American architecture. Other critics have viewed Burges's design more positively. The American architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock thought Trinity perhaps the most satisfactory of all of Burges's works and the best example anywhere of Victorian Gothic collegiate architecture, whilst Charles Handley Reid suggested the college was as in some ways superior to Butterfield's Keble or Seddon's Aberystwyth. The Tower House. From 1875, although he continued to work on the completion of projects already begun, Burges received no further major commissions. The construction, decoration and furnishing of his own home, the Tower House, Melbury Road, Kensington, occupied much of the last 6 years of his life. Burges designed the house in the style of a substantial 13th-century French townhouse, of red brick, and in an L plan. The exterior is plain. The house is not large, its floor plan being little more than 50 feet square. But the approach Burges took to its construction was on a grand scale. The floor depths were sufficient to support rooms 4 or 5 times their size, and the architect Richard Norman Shaw wrote of the concrete foundations as being suitable for a fortress. This approach, combined with Burges's architectural skills and the minimum of exterior decoration, created a building that Crook describes as simple and massive. As was usual with Burges, many elements of earlier designs were adapted and included: the street frontage from the Maconochie House, the cylindrical tower and conical roof from Castelcock, and the interiors from Cardiff Castle. The most complete example of a medieval secular interior produced by the Gothic Revival, and the last. Crook writing on the Tower House. The interior centers on the double-height entrance hall, Burges having avoided the error that he had made at the Maconochie House when he placed a vast central staircase in the middle of the building. At the Tower House, the stair is consigned to the conical tower. The ground floor contains a drawing room, dining room and library, while the first floor holds bedroom suites and a study. If Burges shunned exterior decoration at the Tower House, he more than compensated internally. Each room has a complex iconographic scheme of decoration. That of the hall is time, in the drawing room, love, in Burges's bedroom, the sea. Massive fireplaces with elaborate overmantels were carved and installed, a castle in the library, and mermaids and sea monsters of the deep in his own bedroom. His brother-in-law, Pullen, wrote that Chaucer and Tennyson's poems were Minster Burges' chief textbooks when engaged in designing these decorations. In designing the medieval interior to the house, Burges also illustrated his skill as a jeweler, metalworker and designer, and produced some of his best works of furniture, including the Zodiac settle, the dog cabinet and the great bookcase, the last of which Charles Handley Reid described as occupying a unique position in the history of Victorian painted furniture. The fittings were as elaborate as the furniture. The tap for one of the guest washstands was in the form of a bronze bowl from whose throat water poured into a sink inlaid with silver fish. Within the Tower House, Burges placed some of his finest metalwork. The artist Henry Stacy Marks wrote he could design a chalice as well as a cathedral. His decanters, cups, jugs, forks and spoons were designed with an equal ability to that with which he would design a castle. Upon completion, the Tower House was sensationally received. In a survey of the architecture of the past 50 years, published by the builder in 1893, it was the only private townhouse to be included. In 1966, when the house was empty, Handley Reid described it as unique in London. a precious anthology of designs by one of the most imaginative of all Victorian architects. Crook considers the house the synthesis of Burges's career and a glittering tribute to his achievement. The Tower House, which remains a private home, owned by Jimmy Page for many years, retains much of its internal structural decoration, but the furniture and contents that Burges designed for his home have been dispersed. Metalwork and jewelry. Burges was a notable designer of Gothic-inspired metalwork and jewelry, and he has been cited as Pugin's successor in the Gothic Revival style. Although Burges was foremost an architect, Edmund Gosse described his buildings as more jewel than architecture, and Crook states that Burges's genius as a designer is expressed to perfection in his jewelry and metalwork. He began with religious artifacts, candlesticks, chalices, pectoral crosses as individual commissions or as part of the decorative scheme for buildings over which he had complete artistic control. Examples include the chalices for St. Michael's Church, Brighton, the statue of the angel which stands above St. Finbarr's and which was his personal gift to the cathedral, and the Dunedin crozier. This item, carved in ivory and depicting St. George slaying the dragon, was made for the first bishop of Dunedin. In 1875 Burges published the design in a French magazine as a 13th-century original, an example of his delight in tricks and jokes. Similarly inventive were his designs for fish plates for Lord Bute, in which a service of 18 plates is decorated with punning illustrations, such as a skating skate, and a winged perch seated on the branch of a tree. He also undertook commissions for other patrons, including the Snaid dessert service. On April 3, 1872, Burges produced a Gothic-style brooch for the marriage of the Marquis of Bute to Lady Bute. In September 1873, he produced another brooch for the Marchioness, in the shape of a Gothic G, a gold heraldic shield in enamel, encrusted with gems and pearls. He followed this with a necklace and earrings, an attempt to design in Castellani's archaeological style. Another example of the works that Burges created for Lady Bute as a present for her husband, was a silver cruet set, in the form of two medieval retainers carrying tiny barrels of salt and pepper, the answer to the question of what to give a man who could afford everything. Some of his most notable works, however, were those he created for himself, often with the proceeds of the winning of an architectural competition. Examples include the elephant inkstand, which Crook considers the very epitome of its creator's special genius, the pair of jeweled decanters paid for with the fees for the plans of the Crimea Memorial Church and for his series of lectures, Art Applied to Industry, and the cat cup, created by Barkington in commemoration of the law courts competition, of which Crook writes its technical virtuosity sets standards for the arts and crafts phase. But the overall conception, the range of materials, the ingenuity, the inventiveness, the sheer gusto of the design, is peculiarly, triumphantly Burges. Burges also designed more utilitarian articles which were nonetheless imbued with his love of illusion and punning, including silverware featuring mermaids, spiders and other creatures and a set of knives and forks for the Tower House, with the handles, carved by Nichols, showing symbols of meat and vegetables, veal, venison, onion, pea and so on. He was also a knowledgeable critic, referred to by a contemporary as one of the best judges of armor in Europe. His large collection of armor, parts of which came from the famed collection of Sir Samuel Rush Merrick, was bequeathed to the British Museum upon his death. The whereabouts of some of Burges's most important pieces are unknown, but discoveries are sometimes made. A brooch which he designed as a wedding present for his friend John Pollard Seton was identified on the BBC television series Antiques Roadshow and subsequently sold at auction for £31,000 in August 2011. Stained glass. The impact created by all these glowing, coloured religious images is overwhelming and intoxicating. To enter St. Finbarr's Cathedral is an experience unparalleled in Ireland and rarely matched anywhere. Lawrence writing on the stained glass windows of St. Finbarr's Cathedral. Burges played an important role in the renaissance of High Victorian stained glass. The provision of glass of appropriate color and richness was central to many of his decorative themes, and he invested effort in working with the best cartoonists and manufacturers to achieve this. He also studied the history of glass production, writing in his second Art Applied to Industry lecture, "A use of antiquarian studies is to restore disused arts, and to get all the good we can out of them for our own improvement." In the catalogue to the exhibition of stained glass cartoons from Cardiff Castle, Sargent pays tribute to his deep knowledge of the history and techniques of glass manufacture, and Lawrence considers him a pioneer who, by his painstaking studies, re-established the principles of medieval decoration and used this to make his own bold and original statements. The results were outstanding. Lawrence wrote that Burges designed with a vibrancy, an intensity and a brilliance which no other glassmaker could match. He acknowledges Burges's debt to the manufacturers and craftsmen with whom he worked, in particular, Gualbert Saunders, whose technique gave Burges's glass its most distinctive characteristic, namely the flesh color. This is unique, had no precedents and has had no imitators. As well as at St. Finbarrs, Burges designed stained glass for all of his own significant churches, for reconstructions of medieval churches undertaken by others, and for his secular buildings. He undertook significant work at Waltham Abbey with Edward Burne-Jones, but much of his work there was destroyed in the Blitz. Crook writes, "At Waltham, Burges does not copy. He meets the Middle Ages as an equal." Windows by Burges continue to be discovered. In 2009, a stained glass window found in the vaults of Bath Abbey was confirmed as a design by Burges. The window, which was commissioned by Mallet & Company, featured on the Antiques Roadshow in early 2010 and is currently on display at the Bath Aqua Theatre of Glass. In March 2011, 2 glass panels designed by Burges were purchased for £125,000 by CAD. The panels were part of a set of 20 Burges designed for the chapel at Castlecock but were removed when the unfinished chapel was demolished. 10 of the panels were put on display at Cardiff Castle, and 8 were used in the model of the chapel in the attic room of the Well Tower at Castlecock. The 2 purchased by CAD were considered lost until they failed to sell at auction in Salisbury in 2010. The inspector of ancient monuments for CAD, speaking after their purchase, said, "The panels show a variety of Welsh and British saints and key biblical figures and are of the highest quality Victorian stained glass." William Burges' work attracts enormous worldwide attention and the price reflects the artistic genius of the man and the rare quality of these glass panels. Research has also led to being Burges properly credited with work previously attributed to others. In his 1958 volume on North Somerset and Bristol, Pevsner praises the aesthetic quality of the stained glass at the Church of St. James, in Winscombe, but erroneously describes it as one of the best examples of Morris glass in existence and quite unrecorded. In fact, the glass is by Burges. Furniture. Burges's furniture was, second to his buildings, his major contribution to the Victorian Gothic revival. As Crook writes, "More than anyone, it was Burges, with his eye for detail and his lust for color, who created the furniture appropriate to High Victorian Gothic." Enormous, elaborate and highly painted, Crook considers his art furniture medieval in a way no other designer ever approached. The first detailed study of Burges's work in this area was by Charles Handley Reid in his article in the Burlington Magazine of November 1963. Notes on William Burges's painted furniture. Despised as much as his buildings in the reaction against Victorian taste that occurred in the 20th century, his furniture came back into fashion in the latter part of that century and now commands very high prices. Burges's furniture is characterized by its historical style, its mythological iconography, its vibrant painting and, often, by rather poor workmanship. The great bookcase collapsed in 1878 and required complete restoration. The painting of his furniture was central to Burges's views on its purpose. Describing his ideal medieval chamber in the lecture on furniture, delivered as part of the Art Applied to Industry series, he writes of its fittings being covered with paintings. "It not only did its duty as furniture, but spoke and told a story." The designs were frequently collaborative, with artists from Burges's circle completing the painted panels that they mostly comprise. The contributors were often notable. Voss Sales catalogue for the mirrored sideboard suggesting that some of its panels were by Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edward Burne-Jones. His furniture is witty, inventive and erudite. Gordon Campbell writing on the furniture of Burges in the Grove Encyclopedia of Decorative Arts 2006. Burges's furniture did not receive universal contemporary acclaim. In his major study of English domestic architecture, Das Englische Haus, published some 20 years after Burges's death, Hermann Muthesius wrote of the Tower House, "Worst of all, perhaps, is the furniture. Some of it is in the earlier manner, some of it box-like and painted all over." This style had now become fashionable, though with what historical justification it is not easy to say. Much of his early furniture, such as the great bookcase and the Zodiac settle, was designed for his offices at Buckingham Street and subsequently moved to the Tower House. The great bookcase was also part of Burges's contribution to the medieval court at the 1862 International Exhibition. Others, such as the Yatman cabinet, were created as commissions. Later pieces, such as the Crocker dressing table and the golden bed and its accompanying Vita Nuova washstand, were specifically made for suites of rooms at the Tower House. The Narcissus washstand was originally made for Buckingham Street and subsequently moved to Burges's bedroom at the Tower House. John Betjeman, later poet laureate and a leading champion of the art and architecture of the Victorian Gothic revival, was left the remaining lease on the Tower House, including some of the furniture, by E.R.B. Graham in 1961. He gave the washstand to the novelist Evelyn Waugh, who made it the centerpiece of his 1957 novel, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, in which Pinfold is haunted by the stand. Examples of Burges's painted furniture can be seen in major museums including the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the National Museum Wales and the Manchester Art Gallery. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford, holds a particularly fine collection, begun with a large number of purchases from the estate of Charles and Lavinia Handley Reid, including the Narcissus washstand, Burges's bed and the Crocker dressing table. The most recent acquisition by the Bedford Museum is the Zodiac Settle 1869-70, painted by Henry Stacey Marks. The museum paid £850,000 for the settle, comprising a £480,000 grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, £190,000 from the trustees of the Cecil Higgins Art Gallery and £180,000 from the Art Fund after the British government imposed an export ban on the work. Personal life. Burges, who never married, was considered by his contemporaries to be eccentric, unpredictable, overindulgent and flamboyant. He was also physically unprepossessing, described by the wife of his greatest patron as ugly Burges. Short, fat, and so nearsighted that he once mistook a peacock for a man, Burges appears to have been sensitive about his appearance and very few images of him exist. The known portraits are a painting of 1858 by Edward John Poynter on an internal panel of the Atman cabinet, a photograph from the 1860s, by an unknown author, showing Burges dressed as a court jester, a sketch of 1871 in the graphic by Theodore Blake Wiregman, a pencil drawing in profile of 1875 by Edward William Godwin, 3 posed photographs from 1881 by Henry van der Weyden and a posthumous caricature by Edward Burne-Jones. Whatever his physical shortcomings, his personality, his conversation and his sense of humor were attractive and infectious, Crook commenting that his range of friends covered the whole gamut of pre-Raphaelite London. Burges's childlike nature occasioned comment, Dante Gabriel Rossetti composing a limerick about him Box. There's a babyish party called Burges, who from childhood hardly emerges. If you hadn't been told, he's disgracefully old, you would offer a bullseye to Burges. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's limerick on Burges's childish nature. Robert Kerr's novel of 1879, The Ambassador Extraordinary, involves an architect Georgius Oldhausen, whom Crook considers to be based on Burges. He is not exactly young in years but is in an odd way youthful in appearance and in manners. Georgius can never grow old. His strong point is a disdain for common sense, his vocation is art, a matter of uncommon sense. Burges was a clubbable man. Elected to the Institute of British Architects in 1860, in 1862 he was appointed to its council and in 1863 was elected to the Foreign Architectural Book Society, the FABS, which comprised the Reba elite and was limited to 15 members. He became a member of the Athenaeum Club in 1874, was a member of the Arts Club, the Medieval Society, the Hogarth Club, and was elected to the Royal Academy in the year of his death. As with many of his friends, Burges also joined the Artists' Rifles. Burges was a fanatical collector, particularly of drawings and metalwork. He was also a Freemason, a member of the same London lodge as his fellow architect William Eden Esfield. Other pursuits included ratting and opium. The influence of drugs on his life and his architectural output has been debated, Crook speculating that it was in Constantinople, on his tour in the 1850s, that he first tasted opium, and the Dictionary of Scottish Architects stating with certainty that his early death was brought about at least partly as a result of his bachelor lifestyle of smoking both tobacco and opium. The architectural writer Simon Jenkins speculated as to why Sir John Heathcote Amory chose as his architect an opium-addicted bachelor gothicist who dressed in medieval costume. Burges's own diary of 1865 includes the reference, "Too much opium, did not go to Hayward's wedding," and Crook concludes that it is hard to resist the conclusion that opium reinforced the dreamier elements in his artistic makeup. Death. Burges died, aged 53, in his red bed at the Tower House, at 11:45 p.m. on Wednesday, April 20, 1881. While on a tour of works at Cardiff, he caught a chill and returned to London, half paralyzed, where he lay dying for some 3 weeks. Among his last visitors were Oscar Wilde and James Whistler. He was buried in the tomb he designed for his mother at West Norwood, London. On his death, John Starling Chappell, Burges's office manager and close associate for more than 20 years, wrote, "A constant relationship with one of the brightest ornaments of the profession has rendered the parting most severe. Thank God his work will live and be the admiration of future students. I have hardly got to realize my lonely position yet." He was almost all the world to me. Lady Bute, wife of his greatest patron, wrote, "Dear Burges, ugly Burges, who designed such lovely things, what a duck. He was the most dazzling exponent of the high Victorian dream. Pugin conceived that dream, Rossetti and Burne-Jones painted it, Tennyson sang its glories, Ruskin and Morris formulated its philosophy, but only Burges built it." Crook writing about Burges's role in the high Victorian dream. In St. Finbarrs, together with memorials to his mother and sister, There is a memorial plaque to Burges, designed by him, and erected by his father. It shows the King of Heaven presiding over the four apostles, who hold open the Word of God. Under the inscription, architect of this cathedral, is a simple shield and a small, worn, plaque with a mosaic surround, bearing Burges's entwined initials and name. Legal complications obstructed Burges's wish to be buried in the cathedral he had built. Burges's own words on St. Finbarrs, in his letter of January 1877 to the Bishop of Cork, sum up his career. 50 years hence, the whole affair will be on its trial and, the elements of time and cost being forgotten, the result only will be looked at. The great questions will then be, first, is this work beautiful, and, secondly, have those to whom it was entrusted, done it with all their heart and all their ability? Legacy and influence. On Burges's death in 1881, his contemporary, the architect Edward William Godwin, said of him that no one of the century of this country, or any other that I know of, ever possessed that artistic rule over the kingdom of nature in a measure at all comparable with that which he shared in common with the creator of the Sphinx and the designer of Chartres. But the Gothic revival he championed with such force was in decline. Within 20 years his style was considered hopelessly outdated, and owners of his works sought to eradicate all traces of his efforts. From the 1890s to the later 20th century, Victorian art was under constant assault. Critics writing of the 19th century architectural tragedy, ridiculing the uncompromising ugliness of the era's buildings and attacking the sadistic hatred of beauty of its architects. Of Burges, they wrote almost nothing. His buildings were disregarded or altered, his jewelry and stained glass were lost or ignored, and his furniture was given away. The architectural historian Megan Aldrich writes, he founded no school, had few adherents outside the circle of his practice, and trained no further generation of designers. In comparison with more prolific contemporaries, he completed relatively few works and lost many architectural competitions. Burges's collaborator, the artist Nathaniel Westlake, lamented competitions are seldom given to the best man. Look at the number poor Burges won, or should have won, and I think he executed only one. Burges occasionally acted as a judge in architectural competitions, and Eastlake also commented on Burges's failure to win them. In one case only has he traversed this always arduous road to fame with anything like substantial success. Almost his sole champion in the years after his death was his brother-in-law, Richard Popplewell Pullen. Primarily an illustrator, as well as a scholar and archaeologist, Pullen trained with Alfred Waterhouse in Manchester, before joining Burges's office in the 1850s. In 1859, he married Burges's sister. Following Burges's death in 1881, Pullen lived at the Tower House and published collections of Burges's designs, including architectural designs of William Burges 1883 and the House of William Burges 1886. In his preface to Architectural Designs, Pullen expressed the hope that illustrated volumes of his brother-in-law's work would be warmly welcomed and thoroughly appreciated, not only by his professional brethren, but by all men of educated taste in Europe and America. This hope was not to be fulfilled for 100 years, but Burges's work did continue to attract followers in Japan. Josiah Condor studied under him, and, through Condor's influence, the notable Japanese architect Tatsuno Kingo was articled to Burges in the year before the latter's death. Burges also received brief, but largely favorable, attention in Muthesius's Das Englische Haus, where Muthesius described him as the most talented Gothicist of his day. From the later 20th century to the present, a renaissance has occurred in the study of Victorian art, architecture and design, and Crook contends that Burges's place at the center of that world, as a wide-ranging scholar, an intrepid traveler, a coruscating lecturer, a brilliant decorative designer and an architect of genius, is again appreciated. Crook writes further that, in a career of only some 20 years, he became the most brilliant architect-designer of his generation, and, beyond architecture, his achievements in metalwork, jewelry, furniture and stained glass place him as Pugin's only rival. As the greatest art architect of the Gothic revival, architectural scholarship, Burges's limited output, and the general unpopularity of his work for much of the century following his death, meant that he was little studied. In a 71-page guide to Cardiff Castle, published in 1923, he is referenced only 3 times, and on each occasion his name is misspelt as Burgess. Pevsner's 1951 volume on the exhibits at the Great Exhibition, High Victorian Design, makes no mention of him, despite his significant contributions to the medieval court. The 1950s saw the small beginnings of a reaction against the condemnation of all that the Victorian architects, including Burges, had produced. John Steegman's pioneering study, Consort of Taste, reissued in 1970 as Victorian Taste, with a foreword by Pevsner, was published in 1950 and began a slow turn in the tide of opinion towards a more serious and sympathetic assessment. The exhibition of Victorian and Edwardian decorative arts held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1952 included 5 pieces of his furniture and 4 examples of his metalwork. This was followed by the foundation of the Victorian Society in 1958. Victorian Architecture, a collection of essays edited by Peter Faraday and published in 1963, contained an article on him by Charles Handley Reid, perhaps the first serious scholar of Burges. Handley Reid took a measured view of Burges's work, writing that, as a designer, he was apt to be aggressive rather than charming, but he was in no doubt of Burges's significance, writing of his best works as indispensable examples of Victorian conservanda. The last 30 years, however, have seen a significant revival of interest. Burges's rehabilitation can be dated to 1981, the centenary of his death, when a major exhibition on his life and works was held, firstly at the National Museum, Cardiff, until October 1981, and then at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, from November 1981 to January 1982. The catalogue to that exhibition, entitled The Strange Genius of William Burges, was edited by J. Mordaunt Crook. A much smaller exhibition of his work was also held at the Crawford Municipal Art Gallery in Cork. In the same year, the only full study of Burges, Crook's William Burges and the High Victorian Dream, was published. In the dedication to that volume, in Mem. Chr. Crook acknowledges his debt to Charles Handley Reid, whose notes on Burges Crook inherited following Handley Reid's suicide. A revised edition was published in February 2013. Other sources include articles on Cardiff Castle and Castle Cock and Mark Gerard's The Victorian Country House. The Buildings of England, The Buildings of Wales, The Buildings of Scotland and The Buildings of Ireland series provide comprehensive coverage of Burges's works by county, although in the last instance it is not yet complete. The current 2017 curator of Cardiff Castle, Matthew Williams, has also written a number of Burgesian/Bute articles for the Architectural Press. The Cathedral of St Finbar at Cork, by David Lawrence and Anne Wilson, covers Burges's work in Ireland. List of works. The chronological list of Burges's major buildings is believed to be complete, although some minor works, or minimal additions to pre-existing structures, have not been included. The list of furniture and other works is selective. No listing is given of his extensive creations of jewelry, metalwork and stained glass. Crook has a comprehensive, chronological, appendix of Burges's work with indications as to whether the work is still in situ, was never executed, has been removed elsewhere, has been demolished or where the present location is unknown. Buildings: Salisbury Cathedral, Wiltshire 1855-59, Chapter House restoration. Trevor Benvian, Cornwall, 1858-62, decoration and fittings for Colonel C. L. Somers Cox. Since altered. Gayhurst House, Buckinghamshire, 1858-65, alterations for Lord Carrington. Bew Vicarage, East Riding of Yorkshire, 1859, commission for an unknown client. Maison Dieu, Dover, and Town Hall, 1859-75, alterations and extensions. Waltham Abbey, 1859-77, restoration. Elizabeth Houses and Chapel, Worthing, Sussex 1860, for his father, Alfred, who founded the charity. The Old Schoolhouse, Winchfield, Hampshire, 1860-61. All Saints Church, Fleet, Hampshire, 1860-62. St Finbar's Cathedral, Cork, Ireland, 1863-1904. York Almshouses, Forthampton, Gloucestershire, 1863-64. Church of St James, Winscombe, Somerset, 1863-64. Chancel restoration and stained glass for the Reverend J. A. Yatman. Church of St Helen, Kilnsey, East Riding of Yorkshire, 1864-65, partly paid for by Burges's father, Alfred. Church of St Mary, Forthampton, Gloucestershire, 1864-66, chancel restoration and fittings for the York family. St Anne's Court, Soho, 1864-66, model lodgings for Lachlan Mackintosh Rate. Since demolished. Church of St Nicholas, Charlwood, Surrey, 1864-67. Worcester College, Oxford, 1864-69, redecoration of the chapel in 1873-79, redecoration of the hall. The latter is substantially altered with little of Burges's work remaining, the former complete. Oakwood Hall, Bingley, Yorkshire, 1864-65, internal decoration, in collaboration with Edward Burne-Jones. Since altered. Church of St Peter, Carrigrohan, County Cork, Ireland 1865, extensions for the Reverend Robert Gregg. Skilbeck's Warehouse, London, 1865-66, remodeling of a dry salter's warehouse on Upper Thames Street. since demolished. Holy Trinity Church, Temple Bredy, Crosshaven, County Cork, Ireland, 1866-68. Church of St. Margaret of Antioch, Durenth, Kent, 1866-68. Restoration for the Reverend R. P. Coates, Cardiff Castle, Glamorgan, 1866-1928. Reconstruction and restoration for Lord Bute. St. Michael and All Angels Church, Lowfield Heath, Sussex, 1867-68. Nightshades Court, Tiverton, Devon, 1867-74. St. Michael's Church, Brighton, Sussex, 1868. Designs for extensions, 1892-99. Designs executed. Church of St. John the Baptist, Outwood, Surrey, 1869. Milton Court, Dorking, Surrey, 1869-80. Refurbishment for Lachlan Mackintosh Rate. Chevethorne Vicarage, Chevethorne, Devon, 1870-71. For Sir John Heathcote Emery. Church of Christ the Consoler at Skelton-on-Ure, Yorkshire, 1870-76. Memorial Church for Lady Mary Viner. St. Mary's, Studley Royal, near Fountains Abbey, Yorkshire, 1870-78. Memorial Church and Associated Choristers' House for Lord Ripon. Park House, Cardiff, 1871-80. For Lord Bute's Chief Engineer, James McConaughey and previously known as McConaughey House. Speech Room, Harrow School, 1871-77. Church of All Saints, Merston, Kent, 1872-73. St. Faith's, Stoke Newington, London, 1872-73. Badly damaged by a flying bomb in 1944 and since demolished. Castelcock, Glamorgan, 1872-91. Recreation for Lord Bute. The Choristers' House, St. Mary's, Studley Royal, Yorkshire, 1873. Estate Cottage. Mount Stewart House, Isle of Bute, Oratory, 1873-75. For Lord Bute. Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut, United States, 1873-82. Seabury, Northam, and Jarvis Halls, collectively the Long Walk. The Tower House, Melbury Road, Kensington, 1875-81. For himself. Church of St. John, Cumnock, 1878-80. Completed after Burges's death. Anglican Church, Mariánsk Lázně, Czech Republic, 1879. Memorial Church for Mrs. Anna Scott. Unexecuted designs. Lille Cathedral, 1856. St. Francis Xavier's Cathedral, Adelaide, 1856. Colombo Cathedral, Ceylon, Crimea. Memorial Church, 1856-61. St. John's Cathedral, Brisbane, 1859. Florence Cathedral, West Front, 1862. Sir James G.G.G.B.A. Choi School of Art, Bombay, 1865-66. Royal Courts of Justice, London, 1866-67. St. Paul's Cathedral, London, 1870-77. Interior decoration. St. Mary's Cathedral, Edinburgh Episcopal, Edinburgh, 1873. Lahore Cathedral, 1878. Truro Cathedral, 1878. Major pieces of furniture with locations. Main article. List of furniture by William Burges. The Yatman Cabinet, 1858. The Victoria and Albert Museum. St. Bacchus Sideboard, 1858. Detroit Institute of Arts. The Architecture Cabinet, 1859. National Museum Wales. The Mirrored Buffet, 1859. Present location unknown. Sideboard and Wine Cabinet, 1859. The Art Institute of Chicago. Wines and Beers Sideboard, 1859. Victoria and Albert Museum. The Great Bookcase, 1859-62. Ashmolean Museum. Font at St. Peter's Church, Draycott, Somerset, 1861. Controversially offered up for sale by Bathwells in 2007, but retained on appeal. Taylor Bookcase, 1862. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. Narcissus Washstand, 1865. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. The Red Bed, 1865. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. Crocker Dressing Table, 1867. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. The Clock Cabinet, 1867. Manchester City Art Gallery. Zodiac Settle, 1869-70. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. Purchased by the museum in February 2011 and due for display on the museum's reopening in 2013. Nursery Wardrobe, 1875. The Higgins Art Gallery Museum, Bedford. The Golden Bed, 1879. Nightshades Court, Devon on loan from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Philosophy Cabinet, 1878-79. Designed for the guest bedroom at the Tower House, now in a private collection.